October 1964, Las Vegas, Nevada. The air conditioning in the federal building hummed with a monotonous, mechanical drone fighting a losing battle against the dry desert heat outside. In a sterile room illuminated by flickering fluorescent tubes, a young man sat on a hard wooden chair. His name was Robert Johnson, Jr. He was 22 years old, a soldier in the United States Army, wearing civilian clothes that felt ill-fitting, as if he were trying to shrink inside them. He wasn't there to report a theft. He wasn't there to complain about a neighbor. He was there to drop a nuclear bomb on his own life. Across the metal desk, the FBI agents waited. They were used to cranks, to paranoid delusionals, claiming their dentists were communists or that their televisions were watching them. But the boy in the chair was different. He was shaking not with the jittery energy of a liar, but with the heavy, suffocating vibration of someone crushing under a moral burden too heavy for human shoulders. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I think my father is a spy," he said. For the Russians, the agents exchanged glances. The father in question was Sergeant First Class Robert Lee Johnson, a career soldier, a man with a security clearance, a man who was currently working at the Pentagon. The accusation seemed absurd. The American military in 1964 was a fortress of loyalty, purged and vetted by years of McCarthyism and security protocols. The idea that a non-commissioned officer, a man who had served for nearly 2 decades, could be working for the Kremlin seemed like bad fiction. But as Robert Jr. began to talk, the atmosphere in the room shifted from skepticism to cold dread. He didn't just have suspicions. He had memories. He spoke of midnight drives in Berlin, of strange uncles who spoke with thick accents, of cameras that were too small for family photos, and of a father whose hatred for his own country was only matched by his greed. He described a childhood not measured in baseball games and school plays, but in the terrifying rhythm of espionage, the drop sites, the paranoia, the violence. What the FBI agents in that room didn't yet know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend in those first few minutes, was that they were staring at the end of the most damaging intelligence breach in the history of the United States Army. The man Robert Jr. was describing was not just a spy. He was the vault man. For years, he had possessed the keys to the kingdom, while the CIA was hunting for moles in the State Department. A gray, unremarkable sergeant had been photocopying the blueprints of America's nuclear defense and handing them to Moscow for the price of cheap whiskey and gambling debts. This is not a story about ideology. It is not a story about a brilliant mastermind outwitting the system. It is a story about the banality of evil. It is about how the Cold War was almost lost, not because of a grand strategic failure, but because one mediocre man wanted more money than he earned, and how his son had to destroy his own family to save his country. To understand the magnitude of the betrayal that Robert Jr. was unveiling, we have to leave the neon glare of 1964 Las Vegas and travel back into the ruins of post-war Europe to a city broken in half where the rot began. Berlin, 1952. The city was a jagged scar across the face of Europe. 7 years after the fall of the Third Reich, it remained a landscape of craters and reconstruction, a place where the tectonic plates of East and West ground against each other with sparks of tension that threatened to ignite World War III daily. It was a city of spies, black marketers, and desperate souls. Into this grinder walked Robert Lee Johnson. Johnson was 30 years old, an Army clerk with an unremarkable record and a hollow soul. He was not the hero of his own life. He was a man defined by what he lacked. He lacked money. He lacked respect. He lacked the discipline to advance in rank and the intelligence to succeed in civilian life. He carried a chip on his shoulder the size of a tank. He felt the world owed him a living, and the U.S. Army was failing to pay up. Stationed in Berlin as a clerk, Johnson found a kindred spirit in James Minkin Bow. Minkenbau was a former soldier who had been discharged but stayed in Germany. Drifting through the wreckage of the post-war economy, they were two men bound by a common thread, profound, festering resentment. They sat in smoke-filled bars, drinking cheap German beer, complaining about their superiors, about the system, about the unfairness of American life. They were the perfect targets for recruitment, except they didn't wait to be recruited. In the lore of espionage, the walk-in is a figure of suspicion. Intelligence agencies prefer to select their agents, to find their vulnerabilities and exploit them. A man who walks up to the embassy gate and offers secrets is usually crazy or a plant. But Johnson and Minkenbau were desperate. In early 1953, fueled by alcohol and a delusion of grandeur, they made a decision that would alter the course of the Cold War. They didn't do it for communism. They didn't do it for world peace. They did it because they were broke. Johnson made the first move. He traveled into East Berlin, the Soviet sector. At the time, the Berlin Wall was still 8 years away. The border was a line on a map, guarded but porous. He found a Soviet listening post, a place known to harbor intelligence officers, and essentially knocked on the door. The KGB officers who received him were initially baffled. Here was an American soldier, in uniform, asking to speak to someone in charge. When the KGB realized he was serious, the machinery of Soviet intelligence began to turn. They passed him to the GRU, the main intelligence directorate of the Soviet General Staff. The GRU was less interested in political subversion than the KGB. They wanted hard military data. And Johnson, despite his low rank, was in a position to get it. He was a clerk. In the bureaucracy of the army, clerks are invisible. They file the orders, they type the rosters, they handle the paper that generals read. They are the gears that no one notices until they start turning backwards. The Soviets gave Johnson a coding name and a mission, but more importantly, they gave him validation. For the first time in his life, Robert Lee Johnson felt important. He wasn't just a loser sergeant anymore. He was a secret agent. The Soviets played him perfectly. They fed his ego along with his wallet. They listened to his complaints. They told him he was smart, that he was fooling everyone. It was a psychological seduction that bound Johnson to his handlers tighter than any ideology could. The initial phase of the operation was clumsy, almost amateurish. Johnson stole low-level documents, training schedules, personnel lists, minor logistical reports. He would meet Minkenbau, who acted as the courier, or meet directly with Soviet handlers in safe houses in the East. They taught him the basics of tradecraft, how to check for surveillance, how to use a dead drop, how to conceal money. But even in these early days, the danger was immense. The U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, was aggressive in Berlin. They were hunting for exactly this kind of leak. Johnson was risking a firing squad for a few $100s a month. Yet, he continued. Why? Because the money allowed him to live a double life. He could buy better liquor, visit prostitutes, and play the big shot on the weekends. But the Soviets saw potential. They realized Johnson was greedy and immoral, the two best qualities in a spy. They decided to invest in him. When Johnson's tour in Berlin ended, they didn't cut him loose. They gave him instructions. Stay in the army. Get promoted. Get a better clearance. We will wait. This is the patience of the bear. The Jew was willing to play the long game. They sent Minkenbau back to the United States to undergo formal espionage training, turning the drifter into a professional courier. Johnson, meanwhile, drifted through assignments in the U.S., maintaining radio silence, waiting for his next opportunity. That opportunity came in 1957. Johnson managed to secure a transfer back to Europe. But this time, he wasn't going to a dusty office in Berlin. He was assigned to the Armed Forces Courier Center at Orly Air Base, just outside Paris. To the GRU handlers in Moscow, Reading his transfer orders must have felt like winning the lottery. Orly wasn't just an airbase. It was the jugular vein of NATO information flow. The courier center was the clearinghouse for every classified document entering or leaving the European theater. If a general in the Pentagon sent a top-secret, eyes-only war plan to the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, it went through Orly. And Robert Lee Johnson, the alcoholic, resentful, mediocre sergeant, was going to be the man sorting the mail. The Armed Forces Courier Center at Orly was designed to be impregnable. It was a fortress within a fortress. The documents were stored in a massive, reinforced concrete vault, secured by heavy steel doors with combination locks that were changed regularly. Access was strictly limited. The interior was guarded 24 hours a day. Or at least, that was the theory. The reality, as Johnson discovered, was that security is only as strong as the people who enforce it. And the people at Orly were bored. The courier center was a dull, repetitive place. Bags of mail arrived, bags of mail left. The guards were tired. The protocols were tedious. Johnson, with his gray man persona, fit right in. He was the reliable NCO, the guy who didn't mind taking the unpopular shifts, the nights, the weekends, the holidays. His colleagues thought he was a hard-working soldier, perhaps a bit of a loner, trying to earn some extra time off or avoid his wife. They didn't know that every night shift he volunteered for was a calculated move in a high-stakes game of treason. Gajiu realized that Johnson couldn't just smuggle documents out in his pocket. The volume was too high, and the risk of a random search, however slight, was present. They needed a system. They needed to turn the vault itself into a copying center. But first, Johnson had to solve a physical problem. The classified documents were transported in heavy canvas bags, sealed with lead seals or specialized security locks. To open a bag was to leave evidence of tampering. If the recipient at the other end, say, a general in Heidelberg, saw a broken seal, an investigation would begin immediately. The Soviets went to work. In clandestine meetings in Paris, they provided Johnson with a master class in lockpicking and seal manipulation. They gave him a device to mold false lead seals. They taught him how to carefully pry open the factory-sealed envelopes inside the bags without tearing the paper. They gave him a Minox camera, a tiny, precision-engineered piece of optics that could photograph a page of text in low light. But the camera wasn't enough. The sheer volume of paper was overwhelming. Photographing thousands of pages with a tiny camera inside a vault, while constantly listening for footsteps, was too slow. So Johnson did the unthinkable. He started taking the documents out. The protocol at the courier center required 2 men to be present when the vault was open. But on those long, quiet night shifts or slow Sunday afternoons, the second man would often sleep in the break room, or step out for a long smoke, or Johnson would simply be the senior man on duty with a junior clerk who didn't dare question him. Johnson's method was terrifyingly simple. He would wait for a shipment of top-secret material to arrive on a Friday night, scheduled for delivery on Monday morning. This gave him a 48-hour window. He would select the most sensitive bags, the ones marked with the ominous red stamps of nuclear classifications. He would smuggle the bags out of the vault, hidden in his personal duffel, and walk out to his car. He would drive through the dark streets of Paris to a safe house rented by the Soviets or to Minkenbau's apartment. There, a team of Drew technicians would be waiting. They didn't use tiny spy cameras. They used high-speed industrial photocopiers and professional photography rigs. They would slice open the bags, photograph thousands of pages of war plans, codes, and technical schematics, and then skillfully reseal everything. Before dawn, Johnson would drive back to the base, hungover and exhausted, and place the bags back in the vault. When the couriers arrived on Monday morning to collect the shipments, they were carrying secrets that were already sitting on a desk in Moscow. To understand why Robert Jr., as revelation in 1964, was so devastating, we have to look at what his father was stealing. This wasn't just gossip or low-level troop movements. Between 1958 and 1960, Robert Lee Johnson provided the Soviet Union with a single integrated operational plan, COP, data. He gave them the targeting lists for American nuclear strikes. He gave them the locations of every U.S. nuclear weapon storage site in Europe. Imagine the chessboard of the Cold War. Both sides were staring at each other, fingers hovering over the button. Deterrence relied on uncertainty. The Soviets didn't know exactly where the U.S. would strike, where the missiles were hidden. Johnson removed that uncertainty. He turned the lights on in the dark room. The GRU knew exactly which bunkers in West Germany held the nuclear warheads. They knew the flight paths of the American bombers. They possessed the daily encryption keys for NATO communications. For a period of nearly 2 years, the Soviet Union could read the private thoughts of the U.S. military command in Europe. If Khrushchev had decided to invade West Germany in 1959, the Red Army would have known exactly which bridges to bomb to stop American reinforcements, which depots to strike to neutralize the nuclear response, and exactly what orders the American commanders were issuing to their troops. It would have been a slaughter. And amidst this global theft, there was the human cost. Johnson wasn't just betraying his country, he was destroying his family. The stress of the double life turned him into a monster at home. Robert Johnson, Jr. grew up in a household that felt like a minefield. His father was a man of violent, unpredictable moods. The alcohol was a constant presence, a medication for the nerves that were frayed by years of espionage. Young Robert saw things a child shouldn't see. He saw the strange men who visited the house. Uncle Jim Minkenau, who always seemed to be lurking, bringing gifts that felt like bribes. He saw the whispered arguments between his parents. His mother, Hannelore, was trapped. She knew or suspected what her husband was doing. But she was an Austrian war bride, isolated in the American military community, terrified of her husband's fists, and terrified that if she spoke, she would be deported or imprisoned. Johnson didn't hide his activities from his son as well as he thought. Or perhaps, in his narcissism, he didn't care. Robert Jr. remembered the trips. The times his father would stop the car in the middle of nowhere, grab a package, and disappear into the woods or meet another car, leaving his son waiting in the back seat, shivering in the cold. There is a specific memory that haunted Robert Jr. One night, he found his father counting money stacks of bills that a sergeant shouldn't have. When he asked about it, the reaction was immediate and terrifying. The message was clear: silence is survival. As Robert Jr. entered his teenage years, the resentment hardened into something brittle and dangerous. He loved his country. He absorbed the patriotism of the military bases where he lived. He watched the newsreels of the Berlin crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, knowing that his father was on the other side. The cognitive dissonance was agonizing. How do you salute the flag at school when you know your father is selling it at night? By 1964, the family was back in the United States. Johnson was working at the Pentagon in a less sensitive role, but the damage was done. The domestic abuse had escalated. The mother was broken. Robert Jr., now a young man trying to forge his own identity, realized that he couldn't escape his father's shadow unless he shone a light on it. It wasn't a decision made in a moment of anger. It was a slow, suffocating realization that his father was a cancer, not just to the nation, but to the souls of everyone he touched. The son realized that his father would never stop. The greed was a bottomless pit. So he walked into that office in Las Vegas. He sat in the chair. He took a breath that felt like inhaling broken glass, and he said the words, "My father is a spy." Back in the FBI office, the agents were scrambling. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by the frenetic energy of a major investigation. They needed verification. They needed to know if this kid was telling the truth before they alerted the White House. They pulled Robert Lee Johnson's service record. They checked the travel dates Robert Jr. had provided against Minkenbau's passport records. The matches were perfect. The Uncle Jim the boy described was a real person, a known associate. The dates of the camping trips in Europe coincided perfectly with known movements of Soviet intelligence officers. The FBI realized they had a catastrophe on their hands. But they also had an opportunity. Johnson was still active. Minkenbau was still active. If they moved too fast, the network would go dark. If they arrested Johnson now, they might miss his handlers. They might miss the full extent of what had been stolen. They needed to watch. They needed to listen. They needed Robert Jr. to go back home. Imagine the terror of that assignment. The FBI told the young soldier to return to his parents' house, to sit at the dinner table with the man he had just betrayed, to smile, to make small talk, to watch TV, all while knowing that federal agents were listening to every word, waiting for the slip-up. For Robert Jr., the house was no longer a home. It was a stage set for a tragedy. He watched his father, this small, angry man who had sold the world, and he waited for the hammer to fall. He didn't know that the end, when it came, would be just the beginning of a new nightmare. He didn't know that his father's story wouldn't end in a courtroom, but in a pool of blood years later, by his own hand. But that is the future. For now, the trap is set. The FBI is watching. The KGB is oblivious. And Robert Lee Johnson is sleeping soundly, dreaming of the next payout, unaware that the son he bullied and ignored has just signed his death warrant. November 1964, Northern Virginia. The suburbs of Washington, D.C. lay under a blanket of wet autumn leaves and gray skies. To the casual observer, it was the picture of the American dream. Neatly manicured lawns, station wagons and driveways, the quiet hum of post-war prosperity. But inside the unmarked sedans, parked along the curbs, men in heavy coats were drinking cold coffee and watching a house that had become the epicenter of a national security nightmare. The FBI had moved with terrified speed following Robert Johnson Jr.'s confession. The investigation, codenamed Operation Mint, referencing James Minkenbau, was one of the most sensitive in the Bureau's history. J. Edgar Hoover himself was briefed. The implications were too massive for standard procedure. They weren't just hunting a spy. They were hunting a man who had already gutted the U.S. military's command structure in Europe. The surveillance teams were witnessing the banality of treason. They watched Robert Lee Johnson commute to his mundane job at the Pentagon, where he was now pushing paper in a non-classified role. They watched him yell at his wife, Hannelore. They watched him drink. It was a domestic tragedy masking a geopolitical catastrophe. But the real focus was on James Minkenbau. If Johnson was the thief, Minkenbau was the lifeline to Moscow. The FBI tapped his phone. They followed him to grocery stores. They monitored his mail. What they found was a textbook example of GRU tradecraft operating on American soil. Minkenbau wasn't just a courier. He was a trained deep-cover operative. The FBI surveillance logs revealed a pattern of dead drops, locations where spies leave items for their handlers without ever meeting face-to-face, a loose brick in a park wall, a magnetic container attached to the underside of a mailbox, a hollowed-out rock left by a specific mile marker on a Virginia highway. The agents observed Minkenbau using signal sights, chalk marks on telephone poles or specific window blind arrangements, to signal to his Soviet handlers that a package was ready or that he needed a meeting. It was classic, old-school espionage, happening right next to school bus stops and church parking lots. Inside the Johnson home, Robert Jr. was playing his role to perfection, though it was eating him alive. He had to sit across the dinner table from his father, listening to the man rant about money and the stupidity of the U.S. Army, knowing that a team of federal agents was recording every word through hidden microphones. The tension in that house must have been suffocating a son, waiting for the executioner to arrive for his father. The decision to strike came in late November. The FBI had enough. They had corroborated the son's story. They had the flight logs. They had the bank records showing unexplained cash deposits. They had the surveillance of Minkenbau meeting with known Soviet intelligence officers. Waiting longer risked Johnson or Minkenbau sensing the net closing and fleeing, or worse, the Soviets realizing the network was burned and activating a cleanup operation. The arrest was coordinated to the second. At the Johnson residence, the knock on the door didn't come at midnight with battering rams. It came in the early evening. Agents swarmed the property. When they handcuffed Robert Lee Johnson, his reaction wasn't the defiant shout of a revolutionary. It was the confused, angry sputter of a drunkard being inconvenienced. He looked at his wife, then at his son. The look on Robert Jr.'s face is not recorded in the official files, but one can imagine the complex devastation. This was the moment he had engineered, the moment he had chosen. As his father was led away, the silence of the house was finally broken, replaced by the crackle of police radios. Simultaneously, in Arlington, Virginia, FBI teams kicked in the door of James Minkenbau's apartment. Unlike Johnson, Minkenbau knew exactly what was happening the moment he saw the badges. He didn't fight. He slumped. The weight of 10 years of deception simply collapsed on top of him. Inside Minkenbau's apartment, agents found a treasure trove of spycraft tools. One-time pads, unbreakable cipher sheets, microdot reading equipment, and instructions from Moscow on how to encrypt shortwave radio transmissions. It was a spy kit that confirmed everything Robert Jr. had claimed. The interrogation of Robert Lee Johnson is a case study in criminal psychology. Taken to an interrogation room at the FBI field office, Johnson initially played the role of the misunderstood veteran. He denied everything. "I'm a sergeant first class," he said. "I've served my country for 18 years. But the FBI interrogators had a weapon sharper than any evidence. They understood his narcissism. They knew Johnson didn't spy for ideology. He spied because he felt small, and espionage made him feel big. He spied because he hated the army for not recognizing his genius. The agents changed tactics. Instead of accusing him, they began to minimize his role. They suggested that perhaps Minkenbau was the mastermind, and Johnson was just a pawn, a low-level helper who didn't really do much. "We know Jim was the brains, Bob," one agent might have said. "You probably just handed him a few driver's logs, maybe a cafeteria schedule." This broke him. Johnson's ego couldn't handle being called a pawn. He snapped. "A cafeteria schedule?" Johnson reportedly laughed. "You think I gave them cafeteria schedules? I gave them the whole goddamn war." The floodgates opened. Johnson began to brag. He didn't just confess. He boasted. He detailed the vault at Orly. He described the texture of the wax seals he had melted and reformed. He talked about the sheer weight of the documents, how his arms would ache from carrying duffel bags filled with top secret clearance manuals out to his car. He told them about the nights he spent drinking coffee while Soviet agents in a safe house photographed the Single Integrated Operational Plan, SIOP, the master script for nuclear war. He told them how he would return the documents minutes before the morning shift arrived, the adrenaline buzzing in his veins like electricity. He looked at the FBI agents, men in suits who had spent their careers chasing shadows, and he told them to their faces, "I was the shadow, and you never saw me." As the confession poured out, the mood in the room shifted from triumph to horror. The agents began to realize that this wasn't just a criminal case. This was a military catastrophe. They had to call in experts from the Pentagon and the NSA to sit in and listen, because the FBI agents simply didn't have the technical clearance to understand what Johnson was admitting to stealing. The damage assessment that followed is, to this day, harrowing reading for military historians. Let's break down exactly what the Vault Man had given the GRU-1. the crypto systems. Johnson had access to the encryption center. He didn't just steal messages. He stole the machines and the keys. He provided manuals for the KL-7 Adonis, the standard rotor-based cipher machine used by NATO in the 1950s and 60s. More devastatingly, he provided the daily key lists. Modern encryption relies on a specific setting that changes every day. If you have the machine but not the key, the message is gibberish. If you have the key, the machine turns the gibberish into plain English. By giving the Soviets the keys for past and future months, Johnson allowed the NSA's counterparts in Moscow to go back into their archives of intercepted radio traffic and decrypt everything. Every diplomatic cable, every troop movement order, every private conversation between generals that had been recorded but not understood suddenly. The Soviets could read it all retroactively. 2. A nuclear stockpile. During the Cold War, the U.S. stored thousands of special ammunition items in Europe. These were tactical nuclear weapons, artillery shells, landmines, short-range missile warheads. Their locations were the most closely guarded secret in NATO. The logic was simple. If the Soviets knew where the nukes were, Spetsnaz teams could destroy them in the first hour of a war, leaving NATO with conventional forces only a fight they would lose. Johnson gave them the map. He provided the exact coordinates of the bunkers. He provided the transport schedules. He essentially painted a target on every nuclear depot in West Germany, France, and Italy. 3. The SIOP, Single Integrated Operational Plan. This was the crown jewel. The SIOP was the doomsday book. It detailed exactly what the U.S. would do in the event of nuclear war. It listed which Soviet cities would be vaporized, in what order, by which bombers, and at what time. Possessing the enemy's SIOP is the ultimate strategic advantage. It allowed the Soviet Air Defense Forces, PVO Strany, to position their interceptors and surface-to-air missiles exactly where the American B-52s and B-47s were scheduled to fly. It meant that the U.S. nuclear deterrent, the big stick that kept the peace, was essentially made of glass. Johnson hadn't just stolen paper. He had neutralized the strategic balance of power. The Pentagon analysts listening to Johnson's tape-recorded confession were physically ill. They realized that billions of dollars in defense infrastructure were now obsolete. Every bunker Johnson had identified had to be moved. Every flight path had to be redrawn. Every cipher machine had to be reconfigured or replaced. The cost was astronomical, but the strategic vulnerability was incalculable. In another room, James Minkenbau was telling a different story. If Johnson was the ego, Minkenbau was the craft. His confession revealed the sophistication of the Soviet training program. He described being smuggled into Moscow, not as a tourist, but as a student. He had attended the GRU spy school. There, he learned things that American law enforcement only saw in movies. He explained the use of microdots. This technology allowed the Soviets to shrink a full page of text down to the size of a period at the end of a sentence. Minkenbau could glue a microdot onto a postcard sent to a fake address in Switzerland, and the recipient would use a microscope to read 1,000 words of stolen intelligence. He detailed the use of shortwave radio bursts. He would receive encoded instructions from Moscow on a commercial radio set, listening to a number station, a robotic voice reading strings of random numbers that only he could decipher using a one-time pad. Minkenbau's interrogation revealed the human side of the betrayal. He wasn't driven by the visceral greed of Johnson. He was a lonely man who found a sense of belonging in the secret brotherhood of espionage. The Soviets had treated him with respect. They had given him a purpose. In a sad, twisted way, the KGB was the only family he felt he had. With confessions in hand, the Department of Justice faced a dilemma. The crimes were capital offenses. Under the Espionage Act, specifically given the nuclear nature of the material, Johnson and Minkenbau could be executed. The precedent of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg was still fresh in the American mind, but there was a problem. A public trial would require entering the stolen documents into evidence. To prove Johnson stole the nuclear war plans, the government would have to show the nuclear war plans to a jury, and by extension, to the press. The Pentagon panicked. They could not allow the extent of the breach to become public knowledge. If the American people knew that their nuclear shield had been sold for booze money, confidence in the government would collapse. If the NATO allies, France, Britain, Germany, knew that the U.S. had let a drunk sergeant compromise their own security, the alliance might fracture. So a deal was cut, a quiet, dirty deal. The prosecutors offered Johnson and Minkenbau a plea bargain. If they pleaded guilty and accepted a sentence of 25 years, the government wouldn't seek the death penalty. More importantly, there would be no long drawn-out trial with sensitive evidence. It would be a closed-door affair. Johnson, arrogant to the last, accepted. He likely calculated that 25 years wasn't life. He would be out in his 60s. He probably thought he could write a book. He didn't understand that for a man like him, a traitor who sold out his own son prison wouldn't be a holding cell. It would be a hunting ground. While the lawyers hammered out the plea deal, Robert Johnson, Jr. was left in the wreckage of the explosion he had triggered. The Army didn't give him a medal. There was no parade for the soldier who turned in the super spy. Instead, he became a pariah. In the rigid culture of the 1960s military, the sins of the father cast a long shadow. He was the son of a traitor. His security clearance was pulled. His career prospects evaporated. He was honorably discharged, but it was a cold, administrative exit. He was ushered out the back door of the military he had tried to protect. He found himself alone, his family destroyed, his father in chains, his mother in a state of nervous collapse. Robert Jr. had done the right thing. He had arguably saved the Western Alliance from a catastrophic surprise attack. But virtue, in the world of espionage, is its own punishment. He drifted into civilian life, carrying the trauma of his choice, a choice that no son should ever have to make. As 1964 turned into 1965, Robert Lee Johnson was transported to the United States disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, and then to the federal penitentiary system. The doors slammed shut. The FBI closed the file. The Pentagon began the agonizingly expensive process of changing every lock, key, and code in Europe. But the story wasn't over. Robert Lee Johnson was a man who attracted violence like a magnet. He had betrayed his country, his wife, and his son. He sat in his cell at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, believing he had survived. He believed the worst was behind him. He was wrong. The final act of this tragedy wouldn't be written by a judge or a general. It would be written by a fellow inmate with a piece of sharpened wood in the blind spot of a prison corridor. And the motive would be as twisted and senseless as Johnson's own life. 1965, Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, Pennsylvania. The walls of Lewisburg are thick, designed to keep violent men in and hope out. It is a Gothic fortress of red brick and steel, a place where time slows down to the dripping of a leaky faucet. This was the new kingdom of Robert Lee Johnson. The man who had once held the secrets of the thermonuclear age in his hands was now reduced to a number. Inmate 33,503 to 138. Prison strips a man of his pretenses. In the general population, nobody cared about the vault at Orly. Nobody cared about the GRU or the KL7 crypto machines. To the bank robbers, murderers, and racketeers of Lewisburg, Johnson was just another fish, a middle-aged, soft-bodied man with a whining voice and a chip on his shoulder. But Johnson's psychology inside prison offers a fascinating glimpse into the mind of a traitor. Most spies, when caught, go through a phase of depression or introspection. Johnson did not. He remained defiantly, delusionally narcissistic. According to prison psychiatrists and fellow inmates, Johnson didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a prisoner of war. He would tell anyone who would listen that he was a professional. He bragged about the quality of his tradecraft. He complained that the Russians hadn't paid him enough, and in the next breath claimed that he was a hero to the Soviet Union, expecting that one day, perhaps, there would be a spy swap. He waited for the news that a KGB colonel had been arrested in New York, hoping he would be the chip traded on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin. It was a fantasy. The Soviets had no interest in him. He was a burned asset. In the cold calculus of Moscow, Johnson was a tool that had broken. You don't trade valuable assets to retrieve a broken tool. You discard it. As the months turned into years, the silence from Moscow became deafening. There were no letters with hidden codes. No lawyers paid for by the embassy. Robert Lee Johnson was alone in a concrete box, left to rot by the very masters he had betrayed his family to serve. While Johnson sat in his cell, it is crucial to understand what was happening on the other side of the Iron Curtain. The damage he had caused didn't stop just because he was arrested. Intelligence has a half-life. The secrets Johnson stole continued to radiate toxicity for years. In the deepest archives of the GRU in Moscow, the Johnson files are likely viewed as one of the greatest intelligence coups of the decade. Let's look at the geopolitical impact through the lens of Soviet military planning. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Soviet Union suffered from a massive inferiority complex regarding nuclear delivery systems. They knew the Americans had more bombers and better guidance systems. This insecurity often led to Bluster Khrushchev banging his shoe at the UN, the bluffing about missile production. But thanks to Johnson, the Soviet High Command had a cheat sheet. They knew exactly where the U.S. was strong and, more importantly, where it was blind. Historians have long debated why the Soviets felt confident enough to provoke the Berlin crisis of 1961 or place missiles in Cuba in 1962. While many factors were at play, intelligence derived from sources like Johnson played a critical, invisible role. When you know your enemy's single integrated operational plan, COP, you feel a false sense of control. You believe you can push to the brink because you know exactly where the red lines are drawn on the map. Johnson had given the Soviets the confidence of the gambler who has seen the dealer's cards. This makes him indirectly responsible for the terrified instability of the early 1960s. He didn't just steal paper. He fed the hubris of the Kremlin. Meanwhile, back in the free world, Robert Johnson Jr. was living a tragedy of a different kind. We often talk about the cost of doing the right thing, but rarely do we see the receipt. For Robert Jr., the receipt was a life dismantled. He was a young man in his early 20s, an age when he should have been building a career, falling in love, or enjoying the Cultural Revolution of the 60s. Instead, he was the son of the spy. The stigma was like a brand on his forehead. He tried to visit his mother, Hannelore, but she was a broken woman. The revelation of her husband's double life, followed by the raid, the arrest, and the public shame, had shattered her fragile mental state. She oscillated between blaming her husband and blaming her son for destroying the family. It is a perverse dynamic common in abusive households. The truth-teller is often punished more than the perpetrator. Robert Jr. carried a guilt that was misplaced but heavy. Every time he read a newspaper headline about the Cold War, he wondered if his father was responsible. Every time he applied for a job and had to check the box, "Have any of your relatives been convicted of a felony?" he felt the cage closing in. He eventually moved away, trying to change his narrative, but he couldn't outrun his DNA. He was haunted by the question, was it worth it? He had saved the country, yes, but the country didn't know his name, and his father sat in a cell hating him. Sometime in the late 1960s, a confrontation occurred that captures the utter moral vacuum of Robert Lee Johnson. Robert Jr. went to Lewisburg to visit his father. The visiting room of a federal prison is a place of forced intimacy. Fathers and sons sit across small tables, surrounded by guards and the murmur of other broken families. When Robert Jr. sat down, he might have expected or hoped for some sign of contrition. A sorry, an explanation. A thank you for stopping me before I got us all killed. Instead, he found the same man he had left. Johnson was angry, not at himself, but at his son. He reportedly berated Robert Jr., accusing him of disloyalty. He complained about the prison food. He complained about his lawyer. There was no reckoning. Johnson looked at the son who had turned him in and saw only a rat. He didn't see the young man who had saved his soul from further treason. This lack of remorse is the final nail in the coffin of Johnson's character. He wasn't a tragic figure like Oppenheimer, tortured by what he had done. He was a petty man who was just mad he got caught. Robert Jr. left that prison realized something profound. His father was already dead. The man sitting in the jumpsuit was a shell, animated only by narcissism and bile. It was the last time they would have a meaningful connection. Robert Jr. walked out into the Pennsylvania air, finally understanding that he was an orphan in every way that mattered. As the 1970s dawned, the prison population at Lewisburg began to change. The orderly, rigid system of the 50s was giving way to the racial tensions and gang violence of the new decade. But the danger to Robert Lee Johnson didn't come from a gang. It came from a single disturbed individual. Enter Robert Martin. Robert Martin was another inmate at Lewisburg. He was not a spy. He was not a political prisoner. He was a bank robber serving a long sentence. But Martin was mentally unstable. In the closed ecosystem of the prison, he became fixated on Robert Lee Johnson. The relationship between Johnson and Martin is shrouded in the ambiguity of prison hearsay. Some reports say they were friends, or at least acquaintances who walked the yard together. Others say Martin was bullied by Johnson, or that Johnson, in his arrogance, had insulted him. But there is a darker theory, one that suggests a twisted kind of karmic justice. Martin, suffering from delusions, allegedly began to believe that he was Johnson's son, or at least, he began to project his own father issues onto the spy. Johnson, ever the narcissist, likely enjoyed having a follower or someone to tell his war stories to. He didn't realize that he was feeding a predator. He didn't see that Martin was becoming unhinged. Johnson was used to manipulating people. He had manipulated his wife, his son, his colleagues at Orly. He thought he could manipulate Martin. He was wrong. May 18, 1972. It was a Thursday. Robert Lee Johnson was in the receiving area of the prison, a transitional space where inmates mingled. It was a routine afternoon. Johnson was 50 years old now. His hair was thinning, his face puffy from prison starch. He was looking forward to a visit from his wife, Hannelore, who, despite everything, had continued to visit him. A testament to the complex, tragic bond of their abusive marriage, Hannelore was actually in the waiting room. She was minutes away from seeing him. Robert Martin approached Johnson. There was no shouting match, no dramatic declaration of counter-revolutionary fervor. Martin had fashioned a weapon-A shank, likely made from a sharpened piece of metal or a pipe, honed against the concrete floor until it was a needle. Without warning, Martin lunged. The attack was feral. He stabbed Johnson in the chest. As Johnson fell, gasping, Martin didn't stop. He stabbed him again and again. It was a release of pure, chaotic rage. Guards rushed in. Whistles blew. Johnson lay on the linoleum floor, his life bleeding out under the fluorescent lights. The man who had sold the secrets of nuclear Armageddon was dying not in a mushroom cloud, but in a pool of blood in a hallway in Pennsylvania. Hannelore Johnson, waiting just a few doors away, was told that her visit was canceled. She wouldn't find out until later that her husband had been butchered while she sat reading a magazine in the lobby. Robert Lee Johnson was pronounced dead shortly after. The autopsy cataloged the wounds, but it couldn't catalog the waste of a life. The reaction to his death was muted. The Pentagon didn't mourn. The FBI closed the file permanently. In Moscow, if the news even reached the desk of his former handlers, it likely elicited nothing more than a shrug. A loose end had been tied up. But for Robert Jr., the news must have been a complex shock. The source of his trauma was gone. The monster was dead. But with his death, any chance of closure died too. There would be no deathbed confession, no apology, no explanation of why he had loved money more than his own son. Robert Martin, the killer, was placed in solitary confinement. His motives remained a mix of incoherent ramblings. He claimed Johnson had put a hex on him, or that he was doing the country a favor. In the end, it didn't matter. He was just the instrument of fate. Johnson was buried without military honors. There was no flag draped over the coffin. No 21-gun salute. He was a veteran of 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and the Cold War, but he died a man without a country. His grave is not a pilgrimage site. It is just a plot of earth. The secrets he stole have long since been declassified or rendered obsolete by technology. The money he earned was spent on whiskey that has long since been drunk. The only thing that remained was the scar on the U.S. Army, which had to rebuild its security protocols from scratch, and the scar on the heart of his son, who had to find a way to live the rest of his life carrying the name of a traitor. 1973. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. Robert Lee Johnson was dead and buried in a cheap grave, but his ghost was still walking the corridors of the Department of Defense. In the wake of his murder, the full, classified autopsy of the Johnson breach was finally completed, and the results were terrifying. The U.S. military realized that for nearly a decade, their entire security architecture in Europe had been a hallucination. They had built walls of concrete and steel around their secrets, but they had given the keys to a man who was psychologically unstable, financially desperate, and openly alcoholic. The cost of fixing the damage was astronomical. We are not talking about replacing a few locks. The U.S. Army had to rekey the encryption devices for the entire European theater. They had to physically relocate nuclear weapon storage sites because the GRU had their exact GPS coordinates, or the 1960s equivalent. They had to rewrite the Single Integrated Operational Plan, SIOP, because the Soviets knew the flight paths. Conservative estimates put the cost of the cleanup in the hundreds of millions of dollars adjusted for inflation today. That is a multi-billion-dollar disaster. And that was just the hardware. The political cost was higher. NATO allies were furious. The French and West Germans asked a simple, stinging question. How did a drunk sergeant walk out of your most secure base with our survival plans in a gym bag every weekend for 2 years? The answer was uncomfortable. The system had failed because it was looking for the wrong things. It was looking for communists, for ideologues, for men reading Marx in the barracks. It wasn't looking for a sad, greedy man who just wanted to feel important. If you are a soldier, sailor, or airman today working with nuclear weapons, you are subject to the Personnel Reliability Program, PRP. You are monitored constantly. Your medical records are flagged. If you get a divorce, if you go into debt, if you are seen drinking too much at a bar, you are immediately pulled from duty and your badge is revoked. That program exists, in large part, because of Robert Lee Johnson. Before Johnson, a security clearance was treated like a diploma. Once you had it, you had it. It was assumed that if you were loyal in 1950, you would be loyal in 1960. The Johnson case shattered that assumption. It proved that loyalty is not a permanent state. It is a perishable good. It can rot. The Department of Defense realized they needed a system of continuous evaluation. They studied Johnson's profile and realized the red flags had been there all along. The gambling debts, the domestic violence, the excessive spending, the mood swings. In the old system, these were seen as private matters. In the new system, they were seen as indicators of compromise. Johnson was the patient zero for the modern insider threat doctrine. The Army realized that the most dangerous spy isn't the James Bond figure rappelling down the elevator shaft. It's the boring guy in the cubicle next to you who feels underappreciated and has maxed out his credit cards. Because of Johnson, the concept of the two-person concept, or two-man rule, was rigorously enforced. Never again would one man be allowed alone in a vault with nuclear secrets. Johnson had exploited the laziness of his shift partners. The new regulations made that laziness a court-martial offense. Every time a modern silo door opens or a cryptographic key is inserted, two pairs of eyes must witness it. That is Robert Lee Johnson's legacy, a legacy of permanent, institutionalized mistrust. While the military was overhauling its soul, the other half of the spy team was sitting in a cell, watching the years tick by. James Minkenthau, the courier, the man who had been the bridge between Johnson and the KGB, did not get stabbed. He did not die in a pool of blood. Minkenthau served his time quietly. He was the good inmate. He didn't brag like Johnson. He didn't antagonize the other prisoners. He faded into the gray background of the federal prison system, just as he had faded into the background of Berlin in the 1950s. He was released in the early 1980s. He emerged into a world that had changed. The Cold War was heating up again under Reagan. Technology had moved on. Microdots were being replaced by digital data. Minkenthau returned to civilian life a ghost. There are few records of his final years. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't give interviews. He died in obscurity. His story serves as a counterpoint to Johnson's. Minkenthau was the professional. He treated espionage as a job, served his sentence as a professional hazard, and vanished. He understood the first rule of the game: don't be interesting. Johnson, the narcissist, couldn't handle obscurity, and it got him killed. And what of Robert Johnson, Jr., the boy who sat in that chair in Las Vegas? History has a habit of forgetting the whistleblowers. We remember the villains because they are fascinating. We remember the victims because they are sympathetic. But the people who turn them in the snitches, the rats, the moral arbiters, make us uncomfortable. Robert, Jr. lived a quiet life. He carried the burden of his decision for decades. He had to reconcile two impossible truths. He had done his duty as an American soldier and saved countless lives. He had signed his father's death warrant. There were no talk show circuits for him, no book deals. In the 1960s and 70s, mental health support for trauma was non-existent. He had to process the destruction of his family alone. He married. He worked. He aged. He watched the Berlin Wall fall in 1989, knowing that his father had been a small, dirty brick in that wall. Robert, Jr. is the unsung hero of this story. He represents the terrible price of integrity. It is easy to be a patriot when the enemy is a stranger. It is agonizing to be a patriot when the enemy is the man who taught you to tie your shoes. His action remains one of the most singular acts of courage in the history of U.S. counterintelligence. He didn't just report a crime. He amputated a part of himself to save the whole. As we look back at the Robert Lee Johnson case from the perspective of the 21st century, it is easy to dismiss it as ancient history. We think of microfilm and dead drops as relics, like steam engines. But the Johnson archetype is more relevant today than ever. Look at the major intelligence breaches of the last 40 years. John Walker, Navy, sold crypto keys for cash to pay off debts. Aldrich Ames, CIA, sold names of agents to buy a Jaguar and a bigger house. Robert Hansen, FBI, sold secrets to feed his ego and a strange intellectual superiority complex. Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden leaked data due to ideological dissatisfaction. Jack Teixeira, Air National Guard. 2023. Leaked top-secret maps on a Discord gaming server to impress his teenage friends. The technology changes. Johnson used a Minix camera. Tuxera used a smartphone. Johnson smuggled canvas bags. Snowden used a thumb drive. But the psychology is identical. It is always the gray man. It is always the person you don't suspect because they seem too boring, too mediocre, too low-level to matter. Johnson proved that you don't need to be a general to lose a war. You just need access. In the digital age, a low-level IT administrator has more access than a 1950s general ever did. A 21st century Robert Lee Johnson doesn't need a vault and a car. He needs a password and a USB port. The damage that took Johnson 2 years to inflict physically can now be done in 2 seconds digitally. The military learned from Johnson, but the human factor remains the weak link. You can build firewalls. You can encrypt data. You can build biometric scanners. But eventually, you have to trust a human being to turn the key. And human beings are flawed. They get divorced. They drink. They get angry. They want to feel important. On a quiet runway at Orly Airport today, thousands of passengers rush to catch flights to vacation destinations. They walk over the ground where the courier center once stood. They have no idea that beneath their feet, in the concrete memory of the Cold War, a war was almost lost. The story of Robert Lee Johnson is not just a spy thriller. It is a tragedy of mediocrity. It is the story of a man who was so desperate to be someone that he was willing to become a traitor to do it. He thought he was a player in the great game of nations. He thought he was outsmarting the CIA, the FBI, and the Army. But in the end, he was just a file number in a drawer in Moscow and a corpse in a hallway in Pennsylvania. He left behind a shattered family, a humbled superpower, and a lesson written in red ink. The most dangerous enemy is not the one storming the gates. It is the one holding the door open for them. Robert Johnson, Jr. walked out of that FBI office in 1964 and walked into obscurity, leaving us with a question that still haunts the intelligence community today. Who is in the vault right now? Who is smiling at the guard, checking their watch, and waiting for the moment when no one is looking? The Cold War is over. But the Johnson variation, the angry, invisible man with a secret, is a story that never ends.